All right, part two. Sorry about the two-part video here. Okay, so we covered the Stablecoin Act, which is a genius act. We covered the Clarity Act, which is rules of the road for other cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin, because Bitcoin already has clear rules of the road. And then the third piece of legislation was the Anti-Central Bank Digital Currency, CBDC legislation, which passed, which bans the United States from ever issuing a central bank digital currency. As I was saying, the CBDCs are actually quite terrifying. There's one in China, for example, and it's programmable money where the government does the programming. So the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, which is the central bank of central bankers, is basically real high on CBDCs because of the programmability of the money, specifically the ability to take money from people's accounts without their permission, or to decrease the value of their accounts. So the European Central Bank and the Bank of International Settlements are on record saying that the great thing about central bank digital currencies is that if they want to stimulate the economy with other people's money, they can put a programmatic code on the money that says basically everybody's bank account has to drop by at least 5% per month. Otherwise, they'll confiscate the money and basically just shrink it, and it'll go poof. That's obviously terrifying because the money in your bank account should be yours, and no government should have the ability to decide arbitrarily that they don't like how you are spending or investing your money and be able to manipulate it or confiscate it with the push of a button. At least here in the United States, if the government wants to take your money, generally, for most of the time, in most situations, they have to tax it away from you, or they have to bribe you into giving it up by offering interest on U.S. Treasury bonds or government debt or whatever. So central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are terrifying, ridiculous, stupid, and a bad idea. And as of the anti-CBDC law that passed today, the United States will never have a central bank digital currency. So that's great. Now, the good news is where they have rolled out CBDCs, like in China and other places where they have pilot programs going, basically nobody wants it. Nobody wants the government to control and be able to confiscate with the push of a button their purchasing power. So the government obviously already has that ability by printing more money and devaluing everybody's money, but a central bank digital currency could take it to a whole new level. For example, they could decide that if you make certain purchases with your money, that they will automatically deduct a certain amount. So with a central bank digital currency, if they saw, for example, a transaction go through for gun ownership, they could immediately subtract 25% of your balance. It's ridiculous stuff like that. But it doesn't matter in the United States because the central bank digital currency anti-bill, the bill that bans it, passed in Washington, D.C. today. Meaning we will not have a central bank digital currency, and we don't have to worry about that. We can just focus on Bitcoin. Okay, so what effect does any of these bills have on Bitcoin? One, the Genius Act, the stablecoin bill, does make it easier for people to have stablecoins, which is one step away from Bitcoin. Obviously, it's a stablecoin goes up and down, well, never up, always down with the value of the US dollar. So it's a bad investment because it's never more valuable than $1 US. But it does get you one button click away from buying Bitcoin, as opposed to the hurdles you have to jump through to convert US dollars in their current form. So the stablecoin bill is generally good for Bitcoin because it just moves people closer to Bitcoin. The Clarity Act should give institutions and Wall Street greater comfort around Bitcoin, even though it doesn't directly affect Bitcoin because Bitcoin has had clarity for a long time. Most people on Wall Street don't realize that. So if you ask the average investment professional about Bitcoin, they will say something like, well, I just feel like there's not clear rules of the road. Well, that's just ignorance. They don't realize that there has been clear rules of the road for Bitcoin for a long time. And the Clarity Act now will send the message to the world that there are clear rules of the road for cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin will benefit from that, even though it has had clear rules of the road for a while now. Okay, the two pieces that have not been passed. Oh, and the anti-central bank digital currency bill is good for Bitcoin because we don't have to deal with a central bank digital currency. So two pieces that have not passed are the Bitcoin strategic reserve. So the United States owns some Bitcoin, mostly or entirely from confiscations that they have done in the past. And there's a bill to, we already have a a Bitcoin strategic reserve as a result of executive order, but that can be rescinded with another executive order. So there's an effort to pass a bill creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve, so it's not just protected by an executive order from the president. It has an actual act of Congress behind it. So there's an effort to do that, which would include the U.S. government buying a substantial amount of Bitcoin, which would obviously make the price go up, but it was also hopefully set off an arms race with other countries of everybody accumulating Bitcoin. Now, I'm sort of ambivalent on this point. The more governments adopt Bitcoin, the more they're on the side of the Bitcoiners, like me. So the upside of the government buying Bitcoin is I'd rather be in the same boat with somebody who owns Bitcoin instead of me owning Bitcoin, the government not owning Bitcoin, and the government not liking that I own Bitcoin. So I like the fact that me and the government are on the same boat if the government's buying Bitcoin and I am. But I'm not a fan of government. The government screws up basically everything it touches. The government, and I served obviously for 8 years in the House of Representatives here in Mississippi in the state legislature. And I'm just not a fan of government. I think the government is awful. The incentives are bad. The government almost never does anything good. And generally, I don't want the government to have more financial resources. I want people to have more financial resources. I don't want governments to have more financial resources. So do I want the government buying up a bunch of Bitcoin? Not really, because I would rather all of the people own all the Bitcoin rather than the government sitting on it. Now, obviously, the government's not going to buy up all the Bitcoin because it can't. The price would go, into infinity and beyond if the government started trying to buy up all the Bitcoin. But even if the most they can ever buy up is 1% or 2%, 3%, 5%, something like that, which is possible, the U.S. government could certainly buy up 2%, 3%, 5% of all the Bitcoin, and that would probably send the price to, $1 million in a hurry. That's going to leave behind the 95% of people who do not yet own any Bitcoin. And I would rather have all of those people own Bitcoin rather than just the government hoovering it all up. So I'm sort of ambivalent. I guess I'd rather the government I'd rather have a strategic Bitcoin reserve versus not, because it puts me and the government on the same page. But again, I'm just not a fan of the government owning a bunch of Bitcoin. I would rather the people own the best money in the world and the government be stuck with its useless, printed out of thin air trash that they took off the gold standard, and they deserve to have it lose money because it's their fault. They're the ones who messed it up. So anyway, so that's the quick rundown. The other piece missing is a bill around taxes. There's currently Bitcoin miners are double taxed. I won't go into the nuances of it other than to say it's a fluke with taxes that does not affect people like you and I, but it does affect people running Bitcoin mining computers, which is not something you need to mess with because it's very, very, very difficult to make money in Bitcoin mining. I don't recommend it, so you don't have to worry about it. But there is a need to make it more fair, and it would be more fair if they fixed the double taxation problem of Bitcoin mining. Okay, and then the last piece, which is by far the most important, and would likely be paired with a fix for taxation for Bitcoin mining, is a de minimis, meaning a small amount. The word de minimis, D-E-M-I-N-I-M-U-S, I think, de minimis, however you spell it. A de minimis exemption for Bitcoin purchases to exempt them from capital gains taxation. And the way that works is right now, if you sell Bitcoin or if you buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, you are supposed to pay capital gains tax on the value increase of the Bitcoin. So if you buy Bitcoin when it's $70,000 per coin for $5, and then you sell it when it's $140,000 per coin, which is a 100% increase, and your $5 has turned into $10, and then you use $10 at Starbucks, you're supposed to pay capital gains tax on the $5 increase. You do not pay capital gains tax on the full amount. You only pay capital gains tax on the increase in the value that happened while you held it. And for a variety of reasons I've covered elsewhere on Facebook, the way taxation handles with Bitcoin is actually surprisingly efficient, meaning the amount of tax you pay is actually quite low by comparison for a bunch of reasons I go into in other videos and other posts. But regardless, it's a huge pain. So most people do not feel comfortable spending Bitcoin in the real world because they do not want to worry about taxes on a $5 coffee purchase, etc. So the conversation in Washington right now is, and I don't know that it has enough political support to happen, I certainly hope it does, is a de minimis exemption, which in its ideal form would look like any purchases under $600. I think the most I've ever paid for groceries is $472 at Costco. So under 600 would basically cover pretty much any grocery run, Costco run, etc. You would be able to spend Bitcoin and have it be exempted from capital gains tax. So if you buy Bitcoin, sit on it for a few years, it doubles in value, you use it to buy groceries, as long as the total bill was less than $600, it would be exempted from capital gains taxation, which would mean cryptocurrency platforms would not even have to track it, which would make it much easier to implement Bitcoin into Cash App. Cash App already has it, but I should say Google Pay and Apple Pay would be the big ones. Right now, a major reason that Google Pay and Apple Pay do not have Bitcoin included is because they don't want to deal with capital gains tax and helping people keep up with all that for small purchases. But if there's a $600 exemption to exempt purchases under $600 from capital gains tax, then any of the consumer financial apps would have a much easier time enabling you to pay for anything with Bitcoin up to $600. And most of them would probably, as a result, make it clear that, hey, if you keep your purchases under $600, this is sort of simple and straightforward. If it goes above $600, this gets a lot more complicated. But that would be amazing to be able to save in Bitcoin and spend, virtually every expense in my life, other than the payment on my Tesla, which I've covered in another video. Virtually all of my payments and utilities are under $600. And if I could pay with all of those with appreciated Bitcoin, that would be absolutely amazing. And it would be amazing. So the number one thing I've ever wanted from Washington, D.C. on Bitcoin is an exemption on capital gains for small purchases. And hopefully that will be in the cards. So we'll see. But that is the big one. All this other stuff has been a lot bigger deal for other people in crypto that are doing things that are not Bitcoin, etc. The one that would have the biggest profound effect for Bitcoiners with regard to the de minimis exemption from capital gains taxation, ideally under $600. And if they let me write the bill, obviously I'm not in federal government, Washington, D.C. If they let me write it, I would write it $600 in Bitcoin terms, like 0.00 however much Bitcoin, actual Bitcoin. Like, what is that, 0.006 Bitcoin or whatever that ends up being, 0.005 Bitcoin. Which means as the price of Bitcoin went from being worth $600 of Bitcoin a day. So if the de minimis exemption was in the form of Bitcoin, like 0.005 Bitcoin, then as 0.005 Bitcoin went from being worth $600 to $6,000 between now and when Bitcoin hits $1 million, that would be absolutely amazing. So that's a bridge too far, I'm sure. I think there's less than a 0.1% chance that we will get a de minimis exemption that is denominated in Bitcoin. That would be the absolute holy grail, because that meant the $600 de minimis exemption would rise with the value of Bitcoin. But regardless, even if all we get is a $600 de minimis exemption, that would be an absolute game changer for the ability to use Bitcoin in the real world. And if that was indexed to inflation, obviously that's not nearly as good as indexing it to an amount of Bitcoin. That would be infinitely better. But even if it was indexed to fiat government US dollar inflation, that would still mean the $600 exemption climbed to, $605, $610, $625 over time, which is still better. But anyway, so hopefully my hope and wish and everything is that we get a de minimis exemption under $600 or ideally under 0.005 Bitcoin. That would be an absolute game changer and would radically increase the incentive for people to use Bitcoin to buy stuff, because you basically get all of your gains tax-free if you're buying stuff with Bitcoin, which would be absolutely amazing. But anyway, so that is my hope, that is my prayer, that is my wish, is that we get the $600, ideally 0.005 Bitcoin exemption in Washington, D.C., and that is the one big missing piece that is still on the table. Obviously, there's the double taxation of Bitcoin miners, which is not something I really care about, although, it's important. It's just low on my list. And then there's the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, having that codified in legislation rather than just by executive order. That is, important. But if I could only have one thing in all of this, stuff, the Clarity Act, the Genius Act, the Anti-CBDC Act, probably the thing I value most would be a de minimis exemption for Bitcoin. Maybe second on that list would be the anti-CBDC bill, which is important. But anyway, we might get it all. Hopefully, in the weeks ahead, we will get all of it, which would be pretty fantastic. And I'm just hoping, praying, wishing, thinking, wow, if we could get that de minimis exemption for capital gains tax, everyone would start using Bitcoin for everything, not only because there'd be no tax headaches, but because it'd be the most efficient way to benefit from Bitcoin, is to buy Bitcoin, wait for it to appreciate, and then spend it in increments of less than $600, which would not only let you live life at a discount because your Bitcoin's increasing, but you're also living life at a effectively tax-free, because as long as you're spending it in increments of $600 or less, then all of the gains on your Bitcoin would be exempt from taxation, which would be absolutely fabulous in every way. So that's the rundown on all of that. Let me know if you have questions. Exciting times ahead. Thank you, everyone.